Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to step up attacks on Gaza until Hamas stops firing rockets at Israel. Over 60 Palestinians, mostly civilians, have been killed in the deadly tit-for-tat exchanges.
Meanwhile, state television in Egypt says the main border crossing between Egypt and the Gaza Strip will be opened so that Palestinians injured in Israeli attacks can receive treatment. Middle East correspondent Hayden Cooper reports.
It was a day of mourning in Gaza, but as each Palestinian was buried, another was killed. The Israeli bombardment never stopped. Gaza's hospitals are overrun with the wounded, hundreds of them, many women and children. Palestinian leaders want the world to intervene.
So what is this crime called? What would we call it legally? He who kills an entire family? Isn't this collective punishment? Genocide. This is called genocide.
Israel says it struck 200 Hamas targets on day 2, but it also killed civilians, including children. The bombing failed to stop the rocket fire from Palestinian militants. More long-range missiles were directed at Tel Aviv.
We won't suffer fire on our civilians and on our communities and on our children, and Hamas will pay a very high price. We're in the middle of a battle.
On Gaza's border, fresh Israeli troops are preparing, but the Palestinians too are vowing to fight on. Hamas, though, has announced a list of conditions it wants met for a ceasefire. For the first time, they've named what it would take for them to stop sending those rockets. Among the conditions is the release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. Israel appears in no mood to compromise. Hayden Cooper, ABC News, Jerusalem.
Gabriel Sassoon is an Australian political and foreign communication consultant to the Deputy Speaker of Israel's Parliament.
He joins us now from the Israeli city of Tel Aviv via webcam. Thank you very much for being there with us tonight. Firstly, we're hearing reports now that it's been the deadliest night of Israeli air raids on Gaza in this latest offensive, with up to 20 people now killed. And that's bringing the death toll to at least 76, according to Palestinian authorities. Can you respond to this latest bombardment? Why such a heavy-handed response?
Well, if there were 200 rockets a day landing on Sydney and Melbourne, it's trite to say that we wouldn't be talking about heavy-handed responses. I mean, Australians would be demanding a response. There has to be a response, and Hamas has made a decision to escalate and to ramp up the pressure and to achieve domestic political objectives by firing 200 rockets a day on the city.
I think we're seeing international opinion shift, though, as we're seeing pictures come out of the injuries that we're seeing from the Gaza Strip, and certainly it's being described as a disproportionate response, given that we're talking about largely ineffective missiles against what essentially is a military superpower.
Well, I had to run to shelter twice this morning. I was woken at 8 a.m. After only getting to sleep, dealing with the Australian media till 5:30 in the morning by a siren that I had to run for cover to a bomb shelter within 60 seconds. So if that was happening 200 times a day and half the country, more than half the country was in bomb shelters, then again, I don't think Australians really would be talking about a disproportionate response. But I must say, I'm not a spokesman for the government. I have strong criticisms for how this was handled prior to this, but what happened once this thing spiraled out of control was Hamas made a political decision to make political capital out of the spiraling tensions. There are a number of domestic reasons why they're doing this, and the Egyptians, who brokered a ceasefire in 2012, are nowhere to be found. In fact, the Egyptians there's no love lost between the current Egyptian regime and Hamas, so they privately would very much like to see Hamas pounded even further for days, if not weeks more.
You mentioned the attacks on Tel Aviv, which is a relatively new development in terms of Hamas rockets. Previously, they've only managed to reach southern parts of the country. Is this a new concern for the Israeli government?
Well, we dealt with this in 2012. the Iron Dome missile defense battery is more than 90% effective, and not a single rocket has caused a single death. But that's again no reason to not respond. We can't have 200 rockets landing on Israeli territory every day. It's just untenable. It must stop.
Well, Human Rights Watch is saying, yes, Palestinian rocket attacks on Israel appear to be indiscriminate, and saying, yes, that amounts to war crimes. But they're also saying Israeli attacks targeting homes may amount to prohibited collective punishment. So it's not just Australian criticism. The Israeli government is being criticised by the Human Rights Watch as well.
Well, that's always going to happen in a wartime situation, and that's a matter for international jurists. I know the IDF adheres to strict moral protocols. I must say, however, we're dealing with the usual tit-for-tat, tactic after tactic. Ultimately, the only solution to this is a diplomatic agreement, not just a ceasefire, but a true diplomatic agreement with the moderates. Now, you heard Abbas in your report call what's happening in Gaza now a genocide. This is a man who 2 days ago was making overtures for peace at the Haaretz-sponsored peace conference in Tel Aviv. Now, my belief, and the belief of the Labour Party, Shimon Peres, the outgoing president, is that Mahmoud Abbas is a moderate and a man of peace and a serious partner for peace. Now, if a peace agreement is reached, that will cut the legs out from under the extremists like Hamas. Hamas will have no reason to be, they will not be supported, and they'll have no reason to do this. And by the way, 56 Muslim countries and 22 Arab states have said that they will support a brokered peace agreement between the sides. That's where we need to get to, and that's what people need to be talking about, not about the tit-for-tat. But the reality is, however things spiraled out of control, and by the way, I was at the mourning tent for Mohammed Abu Khadir, who was killed by Jewish terrorists last week. Things have spiraled out of control, but ultimately what must happen is for the rockets to stop. No sovereign country can survive, live with 200 rockets a day pounding its cities and its cultural capital. Imagine if this happened near Melbourne. What would Australia say?
As you say, Gabriel, Sassoon, we have seen overtures from both sides, a cooperation, I guess, but firstly when it came to the abduction of 3 Israeli teenagers and then the subsequent murder of a Palestinian youth by what you describe as an Israeli terrorist. So that has been seen as a glimmer of hope in all this, but then it quickly escalated to what we're seeing now with reports that at least 76 people have died. When you look at the death toll on its own, 76 people according to Palestinian authorities, are Israeli authorities confident that all of those people are militants? Do you accept that some of those people are in fact innocent civilians?
Again, I'm not a spokesman for the government, but it's wartime. I mean, if you're attacking military objectives, there's a question of proportionality in international law, and that's a very, very technical definition. It means, I don't want to go into it, but it means that the proportionality is proportionate to the military objective. So
would you agree, sorry to interrupt there, so would you agree that what the Israeli government is doing now is a proportionate response?
I believe so, and Prime Minister Netanyahu exercised great restraint. But I must say, the fact that civilians die is tragic and appalling. But in a wartime situation, and it doesn't matter that there's no dead on the Israeli side thus far, that's not the point. The point is that the rockets have to stop. Hamas is trying to achieve domestic political objectives. They're firing rockets at Israeli cities. And by the way, they're gaining political capital out of the civilian casualties in Gaza. That's the whole point. So we have to have a ceasefire, first of all. Hopefully the Egyptians will come in earlier than not. I think it's really not to the point that there are, civilian casualties. It's appalling. It's a tragic thing, but it's not reasonable to blame the Israeli government or the Israeli military for that when Hamas is the one being the aggressor in this situation.
Well, Hamas has released a list of conditions as to what it would take to stop the rockets, and among those conditions are the release of Palestinian prisoners. Will that be considered?
Yeah, the great irony of this is Hamas, the assessments were Hamas didn't want this a few days ago. The Israeli government certainly doesn't want this. In fact, since 2012, when there was a ceasefire brokered, Hamas has effectively been raining in rockets from even more extreme groups. Now, ultimately what happened was things spiraled out of control, even more extreme elements started firing rockets, and Hamas decided to make political hay out of Mohammed Abu Khadir's murder in the West Bank. Again, a complex set of events, but look, a ceasefire must be brokered, rockets have to stop, and yes, I assume that a ceasefire will take place and there'll be conditions. I'm not willing to, don't need to get into that. But again, ultimately, a diplomatic agreement is the only solution. Hamas openly stated 3 days ago, they're sick of peace, they're sick of talks, they're sick of negotiations, they're sick of people going to each other's mourning tents and comforting Jews, comforting Muslims, and Muslims comforting Jews. That's not what they want. They're an extremist, fundamentalist religious group, and what they want is war. So the rockets have to stop, and then we can start talking about peace, and it'll cut the legs out from under the extremists, and we won't see this anymore.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Gabriel Sassoon, advisor to the Knesset Deputy Speaker, thank you very much again for joining us from Tel Aviv.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Cardinal George Pell